20,000 years ago, in the deep cold of the last ice age, an ordinary person woke up to an ordinary morning and went on to live one of the fullest, busiest, most skilled days a human being has ever lived. Not a king, not a hero, not someone history wrote down because there was no writing yet and wouldn't be for another 15,000 years. Just a person in a small group of people on a cold morning a very long time ago. Your whole world consisted of about 30 people. They were your family and very nearly every other human being you would ever lay eyes on, which meant there was no such thing as a stranger and no such thing as getting away from your relatives, not even for an afternoon. Just 30 people and a fire on the edge of a frozen plain. So tonight, let's spend an ordinary day with them, start to finish, from the first grey light to the last red glow of the fire. What did they eat for breakfast when there were no farms, no shops, and no such thing as a meal you didn't first have to catch or dig out of the ground? What did they wear in a cold that could kill a person in an afternoon? Who did they answer to when there were no police, no judges, and no laws written down anywhere? And why, on some nights, did a few of them light torches and crawl hundreds of feet into the pitch black of a cave just to paint animals on the wall where almost no one would ever see them? We'll get to all of it soon, slowly. There's no rush tonight. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, and we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if there's something you've always wondered about life back then, what it smelled like, what it felt like, what you would have been good at, leave it down in the comments. I read them, and they make a good company on these long, quiet nights. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights, if they aren't already. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders and tuck your feet in. Close your eyes and let's go back 20,000 years. You've just opened your eyes in the dark and it's very, very cold. You wake up before the light. And here's the first surprise. You didn't sleep straight through the night, and you weren't going to. You don't sleep in one long block the way we try to now. You sleep in pieces. A few hours, then awake for a while in the dark, then a few hours more. This is completely normal. In fact, it's probably the older, more natural way for a human to sleep. People did it this way for most of human history, right up until somebody invented the alarm clock, decided that waking up in the night was a problem rather than a feature, and sentenced the rest of us to lying there at 3 in the morning feeling vaguely like we're doing it wrong. So a while ago, in the dark, you woke up. Not with a jolt, just awake, the way people are at some point most nights. And you didn't only lie there. Maybe you reached over and fed another piece of wood to the fire. Maybe you traded a few quiet words with whoever else was awake, because someone usually was. Then, when nothing needed doing, you let yourself drift back down, and you slept again. None of it was a problem. It was just how a night went. Now it's the real waking. It's grey, and it's bitterly cold, and before you move a single muscle, you do the most important thing you will do all morning. You check the fire. You look at the hearth in the middle of the shelter, and you find the embers, and they're still there. Still glowing, low and orange under a soft layer of ash. Someone woke in the night and fed it, the way someone always does. The fire never went out. And that, more than anything, is what safety smells like. Wood smoke, warm bodies close together, the faint iron smell of yesterday's bones still sitting in the coals. The cold is real, and it's enormous, and it is right there on the other side of the shelter wall. But in here, the fire is still warm. Your people know how to keep a fire alive through the longest, coldest night, because they have been doing it their entire lives. And so you breathe out and you get up. You step to the mouth of the shelter and look out, and the first thing to understand is where you are, because it is not what people usually picture. There's no jungle. There's no golden grassland. This is Ice Age Europe at its coldest, and what's in front of you is a wide, open, frozen plain. Pale grass stiff with frost, a few low, twisted pines and birches hunched along the far ridge, and beyond that, hills white with old snow. The sky is huge. The wind has a real edge to it, the kind that finds the gap in your clothing and goes straight for it. But you don't just look at this place. You read it, the way we read a phone first thing in the morning. Except what you're checking is everything that matters. You read the wind because the wind decides whether the animals can smell you today. You read the sky for the weather coming. You smell the air. And you look far out across the plain for movement. And there it is, a herd of reindeer, a long way off, heads down, breath steaming, drifting slowly across the frost. That's not just a nice view. That's the whole week's food, standing around on four legs in the distance, completely unaware of the part it's about to play. You stand there a moment longer, reading your world the way you've done every morning of your life. The cold is dangerous, yes, but you know exactly what you're looking at. And there is a deep, steady kind of comfort in that. Now, breakfast. And nobody sits down for it. There's no table, no bowls set out, no agreed-upon moment where the whole family gathers in one place to be quietly annoyed with each other over food. You just grab something while you move. A handful of hazelnuts saved from the autumn gather. A strip of dried deer meat, tough as a bootlace, that you chew on for 10 minutes while you do other things. And if you're lucky, the marrow, the rich, fatty inside, cracked out of a bone that's been sitting warm in the coals overnight. It isn't much, but it's real, and it's enough to start a day on, and right now that's all it needs to be. Around you, the camp is waking up the way camps do. Children are already up and already underfoot, getting in the way of absolutely everything, the way children have done since they were children. And over by the wall, an old woman, your mother's mother, is sitting with a half-mended basket in her lap, weaving new strips of bark into the broken side, squinting at the work, humming something quietly to herself with no words to it. She has been mending baskets like this since before your parents were born, which makes her, by the standards of this world, the closest thing to a tenured professional anyone here will ever meet. Her hands know the job so well, she barely has to look. This is the part people forget about the deep past. They picture constant danger, constant drama. But most of it was this: an old woman humming over a basket, a child eating a nut, smoke and mourning, and the ordinary business of a household getting itself going. Not a crisis, just mourning. After a while, the day splits in two. Some people go out to gather. Others go out to hunt. Let's follow the gatherers first. 6 of you set out together. You, your sister, 2 older women who know this land the way you know the back of your own hand, and 2 children, old enough now to carry a small basket without dropping it, which is its own kind of promotion. You'll walk a long way today. 6 miles, maybe 7, out and back across the cold plain. And here's the thing about that walk. There are no signs, no paths, and certainly no map. The entire navigation system for this whole landscape exists inside 2 women's heads, and it is backed up precisely nowhere. They navigate from memory. A white rock shaped like a sleeping animal. The low spot where 3 little streams almost meet. The south-facing slope where the good roots grow deep because it catches what little sun there is. All of that lives inside their heads, every landmark for miles, and not one word of it is written down anywhere. The only place it exists is in their memory. And in yours now, because they teach it to you as you walk, simply by naming everything out loud as you pass it. Then, at the stream crossing, one of the older women stops. There are tracks in the frozen mud, and they're not reindeer tracks. They're the tracks of something with claws. Your heart goes a little faster, but the older woman just looks at them for a moment, reads them, how old, how big, which way it went, says one quiet word, and keeps walking. So you keep walking too. And that, right there, is how courage actually gets passed down. Not as a speech, not as a lesson. Just an older person who has seen all of this before, calmly continuing. And a younger person learning in their body that this is survivable. Because look, she's still walking. You come home later with roots, pine nuts, a little cluster of frozen berries from a sheltered spot, and strips of soft inner birch bark you can chew. Nothing dramatic, everything you need. Now let's go back and follow the others, the hunting party, because they left even before you did, in the dark, and they've been at it for hours. There are 4 of them, 3 men and 1 woman who has been going out on hunts since she was 15 years old and is better at it than most of them. And they are not chasing the reindeer the way you might imagine, sprinting after it with a spear. You can't outrun a reindeer. Nothing about a human body is built for that. But you can do something stranger and, in the end, more powerful. You can outlast it. It works like this. Humans sweat. We are, it turns out, one of the finest long-distance sweating machines that evolution has ever built, which is not the most flattering thing to put on a list of your talents, but is an absolutely magnificent thing to be when you are chasing dinner across a frozen plain. And sweating lets us shed heat and keep going for hours. A reindeer can't do that nearly as well. It runs, it overheats, it has to stop and cool down. So the hunters don't sprint. They follow. They keep the animal moving and never quite let it rest. It bolts ahead, then has to stop, breathing hard. They catch up at a steady walk. It bolts again, less far this time. They keep coming, hour after hour, calm and relentless, until the animal simply has nothing left. When the moment finally comes, it's fast, and it's quiet. And the hunter who makes the kill doesn't whoop or celebrate. They just stand there for a second over the animal, still and a little out of breath, because this animal is about to become food and clothing and tools and thread and warmth for 30 people. And that's worth a moment of standing still before the work begins. And then the work begins, and it is fast, and it wastes nothing. The organs come out first, quickly, before the cold and time can spoil them. And they're some of the richest food on the whole animal, so nobody's wrinkling their nose. The hide comes off in one careful piece, because that hide is going to become someone's coat. The big bones get cracked open for the marrow inside. The long tendons are saved, because dried out, they become sinew, the strong thread that sews every piece of clothing in the camp. Even the hooves have a use. By the time they're done, the only thing left on the frozen ground is the little bit that even the ravens won't bother with. It's during all this that somebody gets hurt. A heavy leg shifts. A sharp hoof catches one of the younger hunters hard across the shin, and it splits the skin. It bleeds. It's going to bruise deep and ugly, and there are still several cold miles to walk home. Now, there's no doctor. There's no bandage in a cabinet, but there is the oldest hunter, the one who has done this maybe 300 times and has the scars to match. And without anyone asking, he crouches down, ties a strip of fresh hide tight around the cut, and says something, we'll never know what, that makes the hurt young hunter laugh out loud in spite of himself. You weren't even there for it, but you'll know it happened, because by the time they limp back into camp, the story of it is already going around the fire ahead of them, getting funnier with every person who tells it. Back at camp, the afternoon is for the quiet work, the work nobody tells stories about. Which is funny, because it's most of what keeps everyone alive. You're scraping a hide. To turn a raw animal skin into something soft enough to wear, you have to scrape every bit of membrane off the inside, then work it until it goes supple, instead of drying out as stiff as a board. It takes most of an afternoon to do one hide properly. Your hands know the motion so well by now that they just do it on their own, while your mind wanders off somewhere warmer. Nearby, a young man is working a piece of flint, not making a new blade, just resharpening one that's gone dull. It makes a steady little sound, tick, 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 almost like music. And 2 feet away from him sits a small child, saying nothing, doing nothing, just watching his hands, watching the angle he holds the stone, watching how hard he presses, and where. Nobody told that child to sit there. Nobody's giving a lesson. This is simply how you learn everything here, by sitting close to someone who's good at something and watching, until one day your own hands know it too. And on the other side of the shelter, someone is threading small shell beads onto a length of sinew. Stop and think about those shells for a second. They came from the sea, a coast that is maybe 200 miles away, a place your band has never once been and never will. Someone your grandmother knew traded for them, long ago, at a big summer gathering where distant groups met. And they've been passed down and restrung and handed on ever since. That little necklace is older than you are. It has traveled farther than you ever will. And it's being mended this cold afternoon by firelight, like it's nothing at all. Then, before full dark, the hunters come home with the meat, and everything changes at once. The fire goes from a working fire to a celebrating fire. Someone piles on more wood. And then comes the best smell in the entire world, a smell every single person there agrees on without ever needing to say it. Meat roasting, fat dripping down onto hot coals and hissing. Roots get buried in the ashes to soften. Marrow gets scooped, warm, straight from the bone. But watch how the food gets handed out, because this is the most important thing that happens all day. It is not random, and it is not first come, first served. It's more like a quiet conversation, conducted entirely in pieces of meat. The old woman who mended baskets all morning gets a good cut. She's earned her place many times over. The injured young hunter gets his share early, without having to ask for it, and without anyone making a thing of it. And the small child on the far side of the fire gets handed a piece of liver first, rich, and exactly what a growing body needs, before any of the adults take theirs. That is not charity. That is something much older and much smarter than charity. You feed the child first because the child can't yet fend for themselves, and you are going to need that child to grow up strong, because one day soon they'll be the one out on the hunt feeding you. Everyone shares, because everyone has had hungry days, and everyone knows the only thing standing between them and the next hungry day is each other. This is what a civilization looks like, thousands of years before anybody had the word for it. With full bellies comes noise, and the noise, after a day like this, is wonderful. Laughter first, then a bit of cheerful arguing, and then the day gets told back to everyone, turned into a story right there on the spot. The hunter's stumble during the chase gets funnier every single time someone retells it. The clawed tracks at the stream crossing get a little scarier, a little closer, with each version. And this isn't lying. It's the opposite of lying, really. It's the record. There are no books and no photographs, so the story is the memory. 20 years from now, that small child by the fire will be grown and will tell their own child about a hunt that happened before that child was even born. And all of it, everything said around that fire tonight, happened in a real language. A full one, with grammar and names and in-jokes, every bit as quick and alive as the one carrying you to sleep right now. People have been truly talking for far longer than they have been doing almost anything else. We just have no idea what it sounded like, because language leaves nothing behind. No bones, no tools, no marks on a cave wall. Their actual words are the one thing from this whole day we will never get back. But the talk around the fire is doing something else too. Something with real teeth. Because in a group of 30 people with no police, no court, and not a single written law, this nightly circle around the fire is the police and the court and the evening news all at once. Who shared today, and who quietly held a little back? Who helped without being asked? Who's been pulling their weight, and who hasn't lately? Your reputation here isn't about pride or popularity. It is, quite literally, a matter of survival. People are paying attention, not in a cruel way, but with the careful, constant attention of people who all understand deep down, that their lives depend on knowing exactly who they can count on. To be known and trusted by your 30 people is the safest thing a person can be. And tonight, full and warm and laughing, you are exactly that. Later, when the laughter has settled down, someone picks up a flute. It's a small one, carved from the hollow wing bone of a bird with a few holes drilled along it. We've actually found these, real flutes, tens of thousands of years old, and they still work. The notes that come out are high and clear and a little strange to ears like ours, because the tune doesn't quite match the music we grew up on. A few people start to hum along. Someone begins a slow, soft beat on a stretched hide, and the children finally stop fidgeting. And then something happens that's hard to put into plain words, so I'll just tell you plainly what it is. The whole group falls into the same rhythm. They breathe together. And as they do, the day's fear gets a little smaller. Because the fear is always there, underneath. The cold, the dark, the animals out beyond the firelight, the simple, fragile fact of being alive in a hard world. It never fully goes away, and they would be foolish to let it. But for a while, with everyone breathing to the same slow beat, it gets smaller. Smaller than the warmth of the fire. Smaller than the sound of people you love, making music in the dark, just because it makes the night feel less like something to be survived and more like something to be enjoyed. There's one more thing these people do, though not tonight and not every night, only on certain nights, for reasons that are theirs and not ours. On those nights, a few of them light torches and walk into a cave, not the mouth of the cave where you'd shelter, deep in, hundreds of feet down into the dark, squeezing through passages, far past the last place any daylight reaches, to a chamber where no one lives and no one needs to go for any practical reason at all. And there, by the light of a single flame, they paint. Horses running across the bare rock. Bison drawn so that a natural bulge in the stone becomes the animal's powerful shoulder. Mammoths in dark outline. And here's the detail that gets me every time. They painted in flickering torchlight. And flickering torchlight is exactly what makes the painted animals look like they're moving. The horses seem to run. They knew that. They chose it. And the obvious question is, why? Why crawl into the freezing dark and do this, where almost no one would ever see it? And the honest answer, the true answer, is that we don't know. We really don't. Maybe it was teaching, a place to show the young what the great animals look like. Maybe it was a ceremony. Maybe it was a way of remembering, or hoping, or something we don't have a word for and never will. People have all kinds of guesses, and the truth is that none of them are certain. But sit with that for a second, because to me, not knowing is more astonishing than any neat answer could be. We don't know why they did it. What we know is that they did. We know it was hard and deliberate and done over and over again across thousands of years. We know that people exactly as human as you felt something so strongly that they carried fire into the deep dark of the earth to put it on a wall. Forever. You don't have to know what it meant to feel how much it mattered. And now, slowly, the day comes to its end. The fire drops down from bright dancing flames to a deep, steady bed of red coals. Someone adds one last log, not to cook anything, not anymore, just to hold the cold off until morning. The sparks lift up off the fire and float into the dark and wink out, one by one, looking for all the world like the stars overhead. People find their places on the bedding, layers of soft hide piled over dried grass and moss, which is warmer than it sounds and softer than you'd think. The children burrow in between the adults, where it's warmest, heads tucked against a shoulder. The old basket mender pulls a hide up to her chin and folds her hands under her cheek. And the young hunter, the one who took the hoof to the shin, stretches out facing the fire, with one arm draped over a dog that has decided tonight that this is where it's sleeping. Yes, a dog. Not quite the dog you know, but well along the way to it, half wild and half friend, drawn to the warmth and the scraps and the company, just as we were drawn to each other. And it's worth its weight in gold tonight, because its ears never fully stop working. So listen to what you fall asleep to. Up close, the soft crack and sigh of the coals and the slow breathing of everyone you love all around you. A little farther out, the rustle of something small moving in the frozen grass. And farther still, way out in the dark, the long whooping call of hyenas and the deep rolling roar of a lion saying something to the night. But it's nothing to worry about, and the dogs know it. Their ears twitch toward the sound and then settle. Nothing in the camp stirs. You are falling asleep to sounds that would freeze a modern person solid with fear. And you sleep easily and you sleep deeply because you are warm and you are fed and you are surrounded on every side by your people and your fire. So that was the day. One ordinary day, 20,000 years ago. And I hope what stays with you is this. It was not a brutal, miserable existence with a few warm moments scattered in. It was a life, a full one, skilled and funny and patient and deeply social, packed with knowledge no single person could ever hold alone, carried instead in 30 heads at once and handed down, careful year after year. They had music, they had art, they had old jokes and old friendships and a child being slipped the best piece of food across the fire. They were not almost people, on their way to becoming us. They were us, exactly as human as you are, lying there right now under your blanket. The cold was real. The danger was real. And they met all of it, every single day for tens of thousands of years, with fire and with cleverness and with each other. And they came through, every one of them, long enough, at least, to pass it all on, which is the only reason you are here at all. You are the inheritor of every cold morning those people got through, every banked fire, every shared meal, every plant named out loud on a long walk so it wouldn't be forgotten. It all came down the long chain of years, hand to hand, all the way to you. Tomorrow, for them, there would be work again. The cold would still be there. The hunt would have to happen all over, but there would also be hazelnuts, and the fire, and the old woman humming over her basket, and someone, somewhere, lifting a little bone flute in the dark. There would also be music. For tonight, though, the work is done. The fire is warm. everyone is home and everyone is sleeping. So let yourself sink down into the blanket the way they sank into the hides. Let your feet stay warm and tucked, and let the long, slow, 20,000-year-old quiet carry you off to sleep. Good night. Picture, if it helps, a low fire burned down past the bright dancing flames into a steady golden glow. Outside the window, it's cold and a little strange, a summer that doesn't feel like summer. And to understand how that came to be, we have to travel a long way east to the far side of the world, to that mountain that almost no one in Europe or America had ever heard of. A mountain that was about to change the sky over every one of their heads, without a single one of them ever knowing why. The mountain was called Tambora. It stood on an island called Sumbawa, in the long green chain of islands that we now call Indonesia. In those days, the Europeans called it the Dutch East Indies, a far and humid corner of the world, all volcanic soil and rice terraces and warm rain, where the sea was the color of polished stone and the forests came right down to the water. Tambora was tall, one of the tallest peaks in all those islands. Just how tall, no one can say now with real certainty. Somewhere around 4,000 meters, give or take. 14,000 feet of green slope rising up out of the sea. High enough that ships passing far offshore could use it to find their way. High enough that the people who lived in its shadow, farming its rich, dark soil, simply thought of it as part of the world, permanent, the way you think of a mountain, the way you think of anything that has always been there, and surely always will be. For years, the mountain had been restless in small ways. A little smoke, a little rumbling deep down, the kind of thing you grow used to and stop noticing. The way you stop hearing a clock. And then, in the spring of 1815, it stopped being something you could ignore. In early April, the mountain spoke. A great booming detonation rolled out across the islands and across the sea. It was so loud and so deep that hundreds of miles away, British soldiers and sailors heard it and thought it was cannon fire. Some of them, certain a ship was in distress or that an enemy was near, actually sent men out to look. They searched the horizon for the battle. There was no battle. There was only the mountain clearing its throat far away. That was the warning, though no one knew to read it as one. And then, on the evening of the 10th of April, 1815, the mountain truly woke. What happened over that night and into the next day is still, 2 centuries later, the largest volcanic eruption in all of recorded human history. Not the largest there has ever been. The Earth has older, deeper secrets than that, but the largest that human beings have ever written down, ever witnessed, ever survived to describe. Columns of fire and ash rose from the summit, up and up, more than 40 kilometers into the sky, past the clouds, past the weather itself, up into that thin, cold, high layer of the atmosphere where nothing living goes. The mountain threw a piece of itself into the heavens, and the sky, for a time, caught fire. Down below, the night turned to a darkness deeper than any night. Ash fell like grey snow, smothering the fields, the forests, the villages. The sea heaved. The air filled with a weight you could feel in your chest. And when, at last, after days, the mountain grew quiet again, it had changed its own shape forever. It had blown away its entire summit. The peak that had risen some 4,000 meters into the air now stood at less than 3,000. Nearly a vertical mile of mountain simply gone. In its place was a vast bowl, a caldera, 6 kilometers across and well over a kilometer deep. A wound in the earth so large you could lose a city inside it. This is the part of the story we tell gently, because it is the saddest part, and then we let it rest. In the lands closest to the mountain, many thousands of people died. The best and most careful counts that scholars have made, going back through old colonial records, suggest that at least 60,000 people, perhaps 70,000, lost their lives. And here is something worth knowing, something the careful historians are at pains to make clear. Most of them did not die in the eruption itself. Most died in the long, hard months that came after, when the ash had buried the crops and the harvests failed, and famine and sickness moved through the islands. The mountain's longest reach was not its fire. It was its silence afterward. The crops that would not grow. Hold that thought gently, because that quiet, far-reaching harm, the harvest that fails, the cold that lingers, is about to travel. Carried not by ships and not by armies, but by the wind itself, high above the world. It is about to reach across the entire planet, and it is going to find its way, eventually, to a cold stone house on the shore of a lake in Switzerland, and to a fireside not so very different from the one we're sitting beside now. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, we have to follow the ash up into the sky. So, how does a single mountain on a single island reach out and touch the whole world? The answer is up high, higher than birds fly, higher than the tallest clouds. When Tambora erupted, it did more than throw ash into the air. The ash, in truth, is the heavy part, the dramatic part, and the ash mostly came back down near the mountain in those falling grey drifts. What travelled, what really travelled, was something you couldn't see at all. The mountain breathed out an enormous quantity of gas, sulphur mostly, many millions of tons of it, flung up past the weather into that high, still, cold layer of the sky we call the stratosphere. And up there, where the air never rains and the winds only circle the globe, that sulphur did something quiet and strange. It met the faint moisture of the high air and turned into a fine, pale haze, a mist of tiny droplets, far too small to see, far too high to feel, a veil. And this veil did not stay over Indonesia. The high winds took hold of it and carried it slowly, patiently, around the curve of the earth, east to west and north and south, spreading thinner and wider month after month until it had wrapped itself like a thin gauze curtain around the entire planet. It was the gentlest thing imaginable, a haze so faint that most people looking up never noticed it at all. And yet, draped over the whole sky, it had a power that no army and no empire has ever had. It turned away the sun, just slightly. Just a little of the sunlight that should have reached the ground was caught by that pale veil and turned back into space. A small theft, a thin shadow laid across the whole world at once. You would think a thing so faint could change nothing. But the warmth of the world is a delicate balance, more delicate than it looks. Take away just a little of the sun, steadily, everywhere, and the whole great machine of the seasons begins to falter. In the years that followed the eruption, the average temperature of the entire planet fell. Not by very much, as a number, by something like half a degree, perhaps a little more. Half a degree, or a degree, of the world's warmth quietly removed. It sounds like nothing, a number you could lose in the rounding, but spread across whole continents, arriving in the cruelest possible season, that small chill was enough to unmake the summer. Enough to push the frost into months that should never see frost. Enough to leave farmers, half a world away from a mountain they had never heard of, standing in their fields in June, watching snow fall on crops that should have been green and rising. And here is the strangest part of all. Not one of them knew why. No one connected the cold grey summer to a mountain in the Indies. How could they? The eruption was a world away, months in the past, known to almost no one. To the people living through that long, wrong year, there was no cause. There was only the weather, behaving as weather never had before, with no explanation and no promise that it would ever end. They were living into the consequence of something they could not see, could not name, and could not have imagined. A shadow cast from the far side of the earth. That, more than anything, is what made the year without a summer so eerie. Not the cold alone, but the mystery of it. The sense of a world quietly out of order for reasons no one could give. So let's go now to those fields. Let's see what that thin veil in the sky actually meant, down on the ground, to ordinary people in the year 1816. We'll begin in New England, in the northeastern corner of America, because that's where some of the strangest scenes of all played out. The spring of 1816 had started ordinarily enough. The people of Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, of upstate New York and Maine did what farming people always did. They watched for the frost to lift, and they put their seeds in the ground, and they waited for the warmth that always came. But the warmth didn't come. Or rather, it came, and then it left again and again, like someone who keeps almost arriving and never quite does. In May, frost crept across the higher ground and killed much of what had been planted. The farmers, frowning, planted again. That's what you do. And then came June. And in June, in the full green heart of what should have been early summer, it snowed. Snow fell in Albany, New York. Snow fell in the hills of Maine. Not a dusting that melts by breakfast, but real snow, drifting down through the leaves of trees that had only just come into their summer green. Birds, caught out by the cold, fell silent or died in the open. Newly sheared sheep shivered in the fields. People woke on June mornings to find the world gone white and still, as if the calendar itself had lost its place and slipped backward into winter. And it didn't stop with June. All through that summer, frost returned. Month after month, a killing cold would settle in the night and blacken whatever had dared to grow. In some places, snow fell even in August, where snow in August had no business being. The corn, which a New England family needed to survive the coming winter, simply would not ripen. It stood stunted and pale in the cold fields and gave almost nothing. The people of that time, with their dry sense of humor in hard years, gave the year a name. They called it 1800 and froze to death. And another name, just as bleak and just as wry. The year there was no summer. For many families, it was the breaking point. They had worked thin, rocky soil for years, and now the very seasons seemed to have turned against them. And so, that year and the year after, thousands upon thousands of them did a hard and hopeful thing. They packed what they could into wagons, and they left. They turned their backs on the cold New England hills and went west, toward Ohio, toward Indiana, toward the wide promise of the country's middle, looking for warmer ground and a kinder sky. Whole counties thinned out. The cold summer didn't just ruin a harvest. It moved people. It redrew the map of a young country, one leaving family at a time. And across the ocean, in Europe, the same pale veil was doing the same quiet harm in its own way. Europe in 1816 did not get the strange June snows of New England. What it got was rain. Endless, cold, grey rain falling on a summer that never warmed. Day after day after day of low cloud and chill and water, soaking the fields, rotting the grain where it stood, drowning the harvest before it could ever be brought in. In Britain and in Ireland, the wheat failed, and the oats failed, and the potatoes failed. In France and across the German lands, the grain came in thin and poor and far too little. And when the harvest fails across a whole continent, the thing that follows is as old as farming itself. The price of bread climbs and climbs until for the poorest people, a loaf of bread costs more than they can possibly pay. There were hungry years before and hungry years after. But this one was severe enough and wide enough that one careful historian looking back called it the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world. The last time, in other words, that the failure of the harvest alone could bring such widespread hunger to that part of the world. In the cities, there was unrest. Crowds gathered. People who could not feed their children do not stay quiet, and they did not stay quiet then. And in the wake of the hunger, as so often follows hunger, came sickness, moving through the weakened and the poor. I tell you this part softly, and I won't linger on it, because it was a hard time, and you are here to rest, not to grieve. But it matters to the story, because it tells you how far the reach of that one mountain truly went. A peak collapses on an island in the Indies. A faint haze drifts up into the sky, and a year later, a family in Ireland, or in the German countryside, or in the hills of Vermont, sits at a thin table in a cold summer, and never once imagines that the empty plate before them was set, in some strange and roundabout way, by a mountain on the far side of the world. It's a humbling thought, really, how connected the world is, how a thing can happen in one place, silent and unseen, and arrive in another as a cold wind, a grey sky, a hard year. We feel most days like the weather over our own heads is our own, local, ours, and mostly it is. But every so often, the world reminds us that the sky is one single sky, stretched over all of us, and that what touches it anywhere can be felt everywhere. Now, I've told you the hard part of this story, and I've told it gently, and we can let it settle behind us now. Because the year without a summer was not only hardship, it was also, strange as it sounds, beautiful, genuinely, eerily beautiful. And it gave the world some unexpected gifts. So let's turn, now, toward the beauty. Let's look up at that veiled sky, not as a source of trouble, but as something to simply behold. Because that same fine haze that stole the summer's warmth did something wonderful to the light. When the sun is low, near the horizon, its light has to travel a long way through the air to reach your eyes. And when that air is full of fine, high particles, the way the whole world's air was in those years, something happens to the colors. The blues are scattered away, and what's left, what reaches you, are the deep ones. The reds, the oranges, the burning golds, and above them, strange washes of violet and rose. And so, in the years right after Tambora, the sunsets were extraordinary. Evening after evening, all across Europe and beyond, the sky would catch fire as the sun went down. Not the ordinary gold of a fine evening, but something richer and stranger. Long, slow twilights that glowed orange and blood red along the horizon, with bands of purple and pink stacked up above, lingering far longer than any sunset should. People stopped in the streets to look. In London, observers wrote down what they saw, evening after evening, these unearthly skies, not knowing they were watching the light of a distant volcano painted across their own horizon. And in the daytime, in some places, the veil grew thick enough to do something even stranger. The sun itself dimmed. It hung in the sky, paler and softer than it should be, and the haze took just enough of its glare away that people could look directly at it. And looking, some of them saw, with their own naked eyes, dark spots on the face of the sun. Sunspots, ordinarily far too bright to see, now visible to anyone who turned their gaze upward through that soft, dimming fog. The sun with its glare gently lifted, showing its quiet, freckled face to whoever cared to look. There is a story that the painters of that age caught these skies and kept them. There was, in England, a great painter of light and weather named Turner, who painted skies as no one before him ever had, all blazing golds and burning smoky reds. And scholars have long noticed how closely the fiery skies in his paintings from those years resemble the real, aerosol-tinted sunsets that hung over Europe after the eruption. We cannot say for certain that he was painting Tambora's light. He left us no note saying so. But many who have studied his work believe that the strange glory of those volcanic evenings found its way onto his canvases, and that when we look at those paintings now, we may be looking at the actual color of that haunted sky, kept for us, brushstroke by brushstroke, by a man who simply painted what he saw. Imagine that, the whole world dimmed and chilled by an invisible veil. And one of the gifts it left behind was a sky so beautiful that people stopped to watch it burn out each evening, and a painter perhaps who loved it enough to keep it forever. But the strangest gift of that strange year, the one most remembered, came from that endless, dreary rain. And to find it, we go back to Europe, to Switzerland, to the shore of a lake. In the summer of 1816, a small group of young English writers had come to the shores of Lake Geneva, that long, deep, beautiful lake cradled in the mountains between Switzerland and France. They had come, as people do, looking for sunshine and mountain air and the calm of the water. What they found, instead, was the year without a summer. There were several of them, gathered around one rented house, a stone villa above the lake called the Villa Diodati. There was the poet Lord Byron, already famous, already scandalous, the most talked about writer of his age. There was his young doctor and travelling companion, a thoughtful man named John Polidori. And visiting nearby were three more. The poet Percy Shelley, a young woman, just 18 years old, named Mary, who would one day be known to the world as Mary Shelley, and her stepsister, Claire. They had imagined, surely, long golden days by the water, boating on the lake, walking in the hills. Instead, the rain came, and the rain stayed. That cold, grey, unrelenting rain that hung over all of Europe that summer fell on Lake Geneva too, day after day, keeping them shut up inside the villa, watching the water stream down the windows, listening to it drum on the roof, while the lake outside lay dim and pewter grey under the low cloud. What do you do, kept indoors for days on end, with the rain at the glass and the fire in the hearth and good company around you? You talk, you read aloud, and if you happen to be some of the most imaginative young writers of your generation, you tell each other stories. By the light of the fire, they read ghost stories to one another. Old German tales of the uncanny, translated into French, full of phantoms and dread. And one evening, with the storm pressing against the windows, Byron made a proposal, a challenge. Each of them, he said, should write a ghost story of their own. Most of them began something and let it drift, the way ideas do. But the young woman, Mary, only 18, could not at first think of anything at all. The others asked her each morning whether she had thought of her story yet, and each morning she had to say that she had not. And then, after a night of talk by the fire, talk of science and life, and whether the dead might somehow be called back, she had a waking dream. A vision, she later called it, of a pale student kneeling beside the thing he had made. A creature, stitched together and shocked into a terrible, sorrowing life. And from that vision, in that cold and rainy summer, in that house above the grey lake, Mary Shelley began to write the story that would become Frankenstein. the tale of a man who builds a living being and then recoils from what he has made. It would be published 2 years later, in 1818, and it would never go out of print again, not in all the years since. A story that we still tell in 100 forms more than 2 centuries later. Born in a stone villa on a rainy night in the year without a summer, and she was not the only one. The young doctor, Polidori, took a fragment of an idea that Byron had sketched and let drop, and he carried it away and shaped it into a story of his own. A story about an elegant, deathless aristocrat who preys upon the living. He called it The Vampire, and when it was published, a few years on, it became the seed from which nearly all our modern stories of vampires would grow. The brooding, charming, immortal figure we know so well in all his many later forms traces back, in part, to that same rainy season by the lake. 2 of the great monsters of our imagination, the lonely creature and the deathless vampire, both born in the same dark summer, in the same shut-in house, because the rain would not stop and the sun would not come, and a handful of brilliant young people had nothing to do but sit by the fire and frighten one another. And Byron himself, in that summer, wrote a poem, a strange, dark, dreaming poem about a world in which the sun goes out. He called it, simply, Darkness. And though he surely did not know that a volcano half a world away had dimmed his own sky, the poem reads now as if the year without a summer was speaking through him. It begins like this: I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went, and came, and brought no day. Morn came and went, and brought no day. Written by a young poet at a rain-streaked window in a summer that had gone wrong in a way no one could explain. He thought, perhaps, that he was only imagining a darkened world. He could not have known that he was living inside the faint, real shadow of a mountain called Tambora, and writing, without meaning to, the truest description of his own strange year. And so the year turned, as years do, and slowly, gently, the world came back. The veil in the high sky did not last forever. Year by year, those fine particles drifted down out of the stratosphere, settling at last back to Earth, thinning the haze, lifting the shadow. The sunlight that had been turned away began once more to reach the ground in full. The temperature crept back up to where it had always been. The frosts retreated to their proper season. The harvests in time came in golden and whole again. The summers returned, warm and ordinary and unremarkable, the way summers are supposed to be. And the strange burning sunsets faded, slowly, back to their everyday gold. Within a few years, it was over, and the world was warm again, and the long, cold year began to slip into memory, half believed, the summer that never came. And here is the thing that stays with me most about this whole story. For the rest of their lives, almost no one who lived through that year ever knew what had caused it. The farmer in Vermont who watched it snow in June. The family in Ireland whose harvest rotted in the rain. The poet at the window above Lake Geneva. None of them ever knew that there had been a mountain. The eruption was too far away, in a place too little known, reported by too few. The connection between the two, between a volcano in the Indies and a cold summer across the world, was simply not a thought that anyone of that time could have had. The very idea that a single eruption could change the weather over the whole planet was not yet part of how people understood the world. That understanding would only come much later. It took another great eruption, decades on, in 1883, when the volcano Krakatoa, not far from Tambora, blew itself apart and once again painted the world's skies with strange and lurid colors. This time, with telegraphs spanning the globe and reports arriving from everywhere at once, scientists could see the pattern as it happened. The eruption, and then the colored skies, and then the cooler weather, all linked together across the whole Earth. And once they had seen it once, they could look back and begin to understand what must have happened all those years before, in that cold and unexplained summer of 1816. It was only in our own modern times, really, with careful study of ice cores and old records and the chemistry of the high air, that the full story came together. That scientists could stand at last in front of the year without a summer and say with confidence, here is what happened. Here is the mountain. Here is the veil. Here is the dimming of the sun and the cold and the failed harvests and the strange, beautiful skies, and even, in their roundabout way, the monsters born by the lake. All of it traced back to one April night on the island of Sumbawa. There's a kind of peace in that, I think, if you sit with it. The people of 1816 lived through one of the strangest years the world has ever known, and they lived through it blind, with no cause and no name to give it. And yet, they came through. They planted again and moved west, and wrote their books, and watched the sunsets, and waited. And in the end, the warmth came back, as warmth does. They never knew the why of it, but the why was there all the same, patient and real, waiting 200 years to be understood. The world makes sense, in the end. It only takes us time to see it. So tonight, if the season outside your own window ever feels strange, or the world feels a little out of order in ways you can't quite name, you might remember the year without a summer. And remember that even then, even in the coldest and most bewildering of years, there was a reason for it, woven quietly into the one great sky we all live beneath. And remember that the warmth came back. The mountain is quiet now. It has been quiet for a long time. On the island of Sumbawa, the great caldera holds its silence, and the green has long since crept back over the slopes, and the sea around it is calm and dark and still. The veil is long gone from the sky. The summers are warm. The harvests are golden. And somewhere, in a quiet library, a worn copy of Frankenstein sits on a shelf, and the rain that wrote it has long since dried. And you are warm. You are safe. The fire has burned down low and golden, and there is nothing more you need to do tonight, and nowhere you need to be. The strange, cold year is 2 centuries behind us, and gentler now in the telling, just a story by the fire, fading softly as you drift. Let it fade. Let the sky go dark and kind above you. Let the warmth stay close. Rest now. The summer always comes back. Sleep well. So settle in now, and let the day fall away behind you. Picture, if it helps, a cold, clear night in an old Dutch city. A row of narrow brick houses with stepped gables leaning gently over a still black canal, their warm reflections wavering in the dark water. A thin skin of ice forming at the edges, and behind one leaded window, high up under the roofline, the small, steady glow of a single candle. Somewhere, a church bell counts the hour and falls silent. That is where we are going tonight. There is nothing you need to follow, and nothing you need to remember, and nowhere you need to be. Just let yourself drift down into that cold, quiet city, and we will begin. To understand how a whole sensible country could lose its head over a single flower, we have to begin with the flower itself, and with how new and how miraculous it once seemed to European eyes. For the tulip is not a Dutch flower. It is not even a European one. It came from far away to the east, from the high, cold, windswept plains and mountains of Central Asia, where its wild ancestors had bloomed for ages, small and tough and brilliant against the grey rock. And for centuries it had been loved and gathered and cultivated in the gardens of the Ottoman world, in the courts of the sultans, where it was honored as one of the most beautiful things a garden could hold, its slender cup admired by poets, its shape embroidered onto silk and painted onto shining tiles, its name a word for elegance itself. And it came west, the old story goes, by a small and almost accidental road. In the middle of the 1500s, an ambassador from the Holy Roman Emperor, a careful and curious man named Bosbek, was sent on a long mission to the glittering court of the Ottoman Sultan, far away in the east. And among all the marvels he saw in that dazzling place, he noticed this flower growing in the gardens and worn, as the fashionable men there wore it, tucked into the very folds of their turbans. He was charmed by it. And when at last, after long years, he journeyed home, he carried back with him into Europe some bulbs and some seeds of this strange and lovely Eastern thing, a curiosity to show the gardeners and scholars of the West. There is even a gentle little tale about the very name we use, the word tulip itself. They say it came from a misunderstanding on that long road home, that a traveller, pointing at the flower and asking a Turkish gardener what the thing was called, was given a word that meant not the flower at all, but the turban that it so resembled, sitting there in the folds of the cloth. And the name simply stuck, a small happy mistake, 400 years old, so that to this very day, every time anyone says the word tulip, they are without the faintest idea of it, calling the flower a turban. Such are the tiny accidents that all of history is quietly built from. From Vienna, the tulip traveled onward into the careful hands of one of the greatest plant scholars of that whole age, a botanist named Carolus Clusius. He was a serious man, a true and patient scientist of flowers who studied the tulip closely and grew it and wrote about it and watched in fascination as it threw out its astonishing range of colors. And near the very end of the 1500s, Clusius came north to take up a great post at the famous old university in the Dutch town of Leiden. And he brought his precious tulips with him and planted them there, in the cool, wet, black soil of Holland. And there, in that flat northern land of water and mist and grey light, something wonderful happened. The tulip loved it. The cool, damp climate of the Low Countries, the rich, sea-laid earth, suited the flower better than anywhere it had yet grown in all of Europe, and it flourished and bloomed as gloriously as ever it had in the warm gardens of the distant East. It was almost as though the flower had been travelling all that long way, all those years, all those thousands of miles, simply looking for Holland, and had finally, quietly, come home. Clusius himself, by all the old accounts, did not want to share his treasures. He guarded his bulbs jealously as specimens for his science, too precious to be sold off into ordinary gardens. And he turned away the wealthy men who came offering him good money for them. But there is a story, and we will come back later tonight to just how far we can trust these old stories. There is a story that one dark night his university garden was robbed, and a great quantity of his guarded bulbs were stolen clean away into the night. And from those stolen bulbs, passed hand to hand and multiplied season upon season, grew the whole great Dutch love affair with the tulip. However it truly began, by theft, or simply by the slow, ordinary spread of a beautiful thing from one garden to the next. By the early 1600s, the flower had escaped the scholars' careful beds and entered the gardens of the wealthy, and the Dutch had begun, quietly, and then not so quietly at all, to fall in love. And it is worth lingering here, in the warm dark, to understand why. Because the tulips they fell in love with were not the tulips you and I know. To us, a tulip is an ordinary, cheerful thing. A simple, solid cup of red or yellow or white that you might buy by the bunch on a Tuesday and never think twice about. But those plain tulips, the solid-coloured ones, were the cheapest and the least regarded of all in the Dutch markets. The ones they truly prized, the ones that would before long drive grown men half out of their wits, were the strange and spectacular ones they called the broken tulips. Picture one of them, slowly. On a single petal, a ground of pure, clean white, white as the snow on the gables, and running up through that white, from the dark base of the cup all the way to the curling tip, long, delicate flames and feathers of deep crimson, or of wine-dark violet, or of dusky imperial purple. No two flowers were ever marked in quite the same way. Each one was a small, unrepeatable painting, made by nothing but the flower itself, fine as if drawn by the most delicate brush a master ever held. The white and the colour flowing into one another in feathers and flares and streaks of an elegance that hardly seemed possible in a living thing. To the people of that age, who had never seen the like, they did not look quite real. They looked like something out of a dream. And the finest of them had names, grand names, like the titles of nobility, for these were the aristocrats of the flower world. There was the viceroy, and the admiral of admirals, and the general of generals. There was the Admiral van der Eyck, and the paragon. And grandest of all, the rarest, the most coveted, the most impossibly legendary flower in the entire world, the Semper Augustus. A bloom of flawless white, feathered all over with flame red, rising from a deep blue shadowed base, of which, so people whispered, only a tiny handful of bulbs existed anywhere on the face of the earth. Men spoke of the Semper Augustus the way men speak of a famous diamond or a crown jewel. To own one was to own a piece of living legend. For this is what the tulip had quietly become in that prosperous land. It was not merely a flower. It had grown into a kind of badge, a thing that announced to anyone who saw it bloom in your garden or stand in a costly glass in your window, that here was a person of wealth and refinement and taste. To grow fine tulips was to show the world that you had arrived. And so the rich and the would-be rich alike began to covet them and to compete, quietly and then not so quietly, for the loveliest and the rarest, and the prices of the finest bulbs, all through the early 1600s, began to climb. And here is the secret hidden at the very center of all of it. The secret that not one single soul in that whole feverish century ever understood. That gorgeous flaming pattern, the very thing that made these flowers so precious and so prized, was caused, in truth, by a sickness. The broken tulips were, every last one of them, gently and invisibly diseased. They carried something passed quietly from plant to plant, something so small that no one on earth would even glimpse its true nature for 300 more years. And that same hidden illness that painted those magnificent flames across the petals also weakened the bulb that bore them, so that it grew slowly and feebly and put out fewer and fewer offspring with every passing season. The most beautiful tulips in the world were also the sickest and the frailest, and therefore the rarest. No one could simply grow more of them to order, however much gold he laid on the table. One could only plant a prize bulb and wait and hope and watch it put out one or two small pale offshoots in a whole year, like a slow and grudging little miracle drawn up out of the cold ground. The beauty was real, and the beauty was desperately, achingly scarce. And scarcity, as we are about to see, is a kind of slow and patient fuel, waiting only for a spark. Let yourself settle a little deeper now into the warm and the dark as the years turn and the love of the flower spreads through that small, rich country. There is no hurry at all to this story. We have the whole long night. For the passion for tulips spread all through those years, outward and downward, from the gardens of the very richest into the lives of more and more ordinary people. To grow fine tulips, even modest ones, became the mark of a person of standing and good taste. The wealthiest collectors laid out walled gardens behind their tall canal houses, formal beds in neat geometric patterns, each precious variety labelled on its little painted stake. And because the flower itself bloomed for only a week or two each spring and then was gone, they paid artists to paint their tulips so that they might enjoy them all year round. These paintings were gathered into beautiful books, the tulip books, they were called, page upon page of exquisite watercolors on thick cream vellum, each flower painted life-sized in all its feathered glory, its grand name lettered beneath, and, tellingly, sometimes its price. Some of those beautiful books survive to this day in the great museums, and the most famous painting of the Semper Augustus that we still have is a watercolor from one of them, the closest any of us will ever come to seeing, with our own eyes, the most expensive flower that ever bloomed. So it began, as these things so often do, as something gentle and lovely and harmless, the pleasure of people who loved beautiful flowers and could afford to indulge that love. But somewhere in the rising of it, slowly, the thing began to change its nature. For where there is a beautiful thing that is genuinely rare and that everyone of taste suddenly desires, there comes, sooner or later, as surely as winter, the question of price. And the prices of the finest tulips had been climbing, season upon season, until they had begun to draw the eye not only of the gardener, but of the trader, of men who saw in this beloved flower not a thing to plant and admire, but a thing to buy cheaply and sell dear. And that was the spark, dropped at last into all that patient fuel. Now, to understand the true strangeness of what came next, you have to understand one quiet, peculiar fact about the way a tulip actually lives, a small detail of nature that lies, oddly, at the very heart of the whole wild affair. For a tulip is not a flower you can hold up and admire whenever you please. It blooms for only a week or two in the spring, and then the petals fall, and the show is over for another whole year. And for all the long rest of that year, the whole of the summer, and the autumn, and the deep frozen heart of the winter, the tulip is not a flower at all. it is only a bulb. A plain, brown, papery thing, much like an onion, lying asleep and hidden in the dark earth, showing nothing whatever of itself above the ground. And so a trade grew up, strangest of all trades, around a thing that, for most of the year, could not even be seen. Through the warm months, when the bulbs could be safely lifted from the soil, a grower sold them in the ordinary way, hand to hand, the solid bulb passing from one palm to the next. But the hunger for tulips had grown so much greater than those few summer months could ever feed. And so, through the autumn and into the deep of winter, when every tulip bulb in the whole country lay sleeping underground, and there was nothing at all, to see or to touch or to dig up, the Dutch went on buying and selling them anyway. They bought and sold flowers that were not flowers yet, bulbs they could not lift, blooms no living eye had seen and would not see for months. They traded slips of paper. They traded promises. "I will buy that buried bulb from you," the contract said, "when the spring comes and you dig it up for such and such a price." And they had a perfect plain name for this peculiar business. They called it the wind handle, the wind trade, the trade in wind. And where this trade in wind took place was not some grand exchange, not some marble hall of commerce with high, serious windows and clerks. It happened in the back rooms of taverns, on long winter evenings, by the light of tallow candles. Picture the scene, for it is a cozy one, whatever its folly. Outside, the frozen dark, the canals icing over, the snow heaped soft on the gables, the cold pressing at the shutters. And inside, a low, warm room, smoke-darkened beams close overhead, the smell of pipe smoke and spilled wine and damp wool, the fire muttering in the grate. And around a scarred wooden table, a dozen men in sober black coats and clean white collars, leaning in close in the candlelight, buying and selling the most beautiful flowers in the world, flowers that at that very moment were nothing but cold sleeping bulbs in the frozen ground, streets and streets away across the dark city. They called these little gatherings their colleges, half in jest, as though they were grave societies of learned men. There was a small fee, a few coins of wine money paid to the house for the privilege. There were customs and rules to the bidding, understood by all. There was warmth and good fellowship and wine and rising laughter, and beneath all of it, the quickening, intoxicating excitement of watching numbers climb. And no money, often changed hands on the night, only the promise, written into a book, sealed with a handshake, to settle up come the spring. And the men who gathered in those warm rooms were no longer only the wealthy. As the prices rose and the stories spread, more and more ordinary people were drawn in. Weavers and bakers and joiners and tradesmen of every kind, sober and hard-working folk who in any other year would never have dreamed of staking money on anything. And it would be easy, looking back, to call them greedy or foolish. But it was something gentler and more human than that. It was hope. For they had watched their neighbors grow richer, week by week, on nothing but slips of paper and a beautiful flower. And it seemed, suddenly, that here was a door standing open into a brighter and an easier life. The simple, decent hope of getting on a little in the world, of one day owning fine things and a finer house, of leaving their children better off than themselves. The tulip, the loveliest thing that money could buy, seemed to be offering itself as the gentlest ladder up toward all of it. And so they walked through the open door, the same as everyone else. And the prices climbed, and they climbed with them, and so did half the country. For this is the way of such things, and it has been the way of them in every age and every land since. As more and more people saw their neighbors growing richer, on paper, on nothing but promises, more and more of them wanted in. And as more wanted in, the prices rose. And as the prices rose, the profits looked sweeter still. And as the profits looked sweeter, yet more came crowding in. The old spiral, turning faster and faster, feeding upon itself, each turn making the next turn seem only sensible. A bulb that had sold for a modest sum one autumn might sell for 10 times that by the dead of the same winter. A single contract might change hands 5 or 6 times in a season, passed from buyer to buyer to buyer, each one selling it onward for a little more than he paid, and none of them, not one, ever seeing or touching or planting a single actual flower. The tulips bloomed only in the imagination now. The real flowers slept on, untroubled, under the frozen ground, while above them, in the warm, bright taverns, their phantom selves were bought and sold for fortunes. And what fortunes? Let me give you a way to feel the size of it, lying there in the dark. A skilled craftsman in Holland in those days, a good carpenter, a master weaver, an honest tradesman at the very top of his craft, might earn, in a whole year of solid work, a few 100 guilders. And at the dizzy height of the fever, a single bulb of the rarest sort could change hands for thousands of guilders, for more, far more, than such a man could earn in 10 years of labor, in 20, in a whole working lifetime. For a flower, for the wintertime promise of a flower, still fast asleep in the cold, dark earth. The grandest of them all, the legendary Semper Augustus, was spoken of at sums so vast they sound like numbers out of a fairy story. Enough, men said, to buy one of the fine tall houses on the very best canal in all of Amsterdam. For one bulb. For one sleeping bulb of one impossibly beautiful flower. It is here, around this giddy, glittering height, that the famous stories begin, the wild and wonderful tales that have been told about the Tulip Mania ever since, for nearly 400 years. And they are such very good stories that I want to tell them to you now, properly, in all their color, in the warm dark, exactly the way the old books love to tell them. So let me tell them the way they have been told for centuries, and then, a little later tonight, gently, the two of us together, we will sit and sort out how much of all of it was ever really true. The first tale, and the most famous of them all, is the tale of the sailor and the onion. It goes like this. There was a wealthy Dutch merchant, a great dealer in the rarest tulips, who had just taken delivery at enormous cost of one of his very greatest treasures, a single bulb of the Semper Augustus itself, worth a small fortune, which he set down with care on the counter of his counting house. That same morning, a sailor came to his door, a rough, honest seaman just off a long voyage, bringing the welcome news that one of the merchant's ships had safely come into port. The merchant, delighted, rewarded the man, as was the kindly custom, with a fine breakfast, a good red herring, to eat or to carry away. And the sailor, a simple fellow who knew the sea and the rigging and the stars, but knew nothing in the world of flowers, happened to spy, lying there on the rich man's counter, what looked for all the world like a common onion. And thinking it a humble thing, and just the sharp, sweet relish a man wants beside a herring, he quietly slipped it into his pocket and wandered off down to the quayside and sat himself in the cold, thin sunshine by the water and ate the single most expensive breakfast in the entire history of the world. They say the merchant, discovering his treasure gone, ran frantic through the streets and found the poor sailor at last down on the dock, just swallowing the final bite of a flower bulb worth enough to have fed a ship's whole crew for a year, and that the bewildered sailor was seized and hauled away to prison for it, baffled to the very last about what monstrous crime a man could possibly commit with an onion and a fish. The second tale is much the same in spirit, and just as fondly told. There was, they say, an English gentleman, a traveller, an amateur student of plants, who knew his herbs and his flowers, but knew nothing of the strange Dutch passion or the strange Dutch prices. He was visiting the house and garden of a wealthy Dutchman, and there, in a greenhouse, he came upon a curious bulb, apparently just left lying on a bench. And being a curious sort of man, the sort who likes to take a thing apart to see how it is made, he drew out his little pocket knife and began, calmly and methodically, to peel it and to cut it open, layer by patient layer, to study the secret structure of the flower folded up inside, remarking quietly to himself all the while on how very like a common onion the thing appeared to be. He was, of course, dissecting one of the most valuable objects in the entire country. The owner came upon him at his work and found his priceless treasure lying in neat, ruined slices upon the bench, and the astonished Englishman, who had meant no harm in all the world and had only wanted to understand a flower, was marched off before a magistrate to answer for a sum of money so vast he could scarcely believe it existed, all over a thing that looked, to his eyes, exactly like an onion. And the third tale is not about a foolish man at all, but about a single price, and it is the one that truly stops the breath. For there survives a famous list, an old, careful accounting of what was supposedly given in one single trade for one single bulb of a tulip called the Viceroy, and the Viceroy was not even the most precious of the varieties. Let me read you that list, slowly, in the dark, and you tell me if you can hold it all in your mind at once. For that one bulb, they say, a man gave 2 whole loads of wheat and 4 whole loads of rye, 4 fat oxen and 8 fat pigs and a dozen fat sheep, 2 great barrels of wine and 4 barrels of beer and 2 barrels of butter, 1,000 pounds of cheese, a complete bed with all its sheets and hangings, a full and proper suit of fine clothes, and, to round the whole bargain off, a silver drinking cup. Stand in that for a moment, in the warm dark. Everything a comfortable family might eat for years and years, and the very bed they would sleep in, and the clothes upon their backs, and a silver cup besides, the entire furnishing of a whole settled, prosperous life, all of it handed over, gladly, eagerly, for one brown sleeping bulb. On the strength of the single flame-colored flower, it might, come the spring, unfold into. And there were other tales told too, in the same astonished breath, of a single Semper Augustus offered for 12 good acres of farmland, of bulbs swapped for whole fine houses on the best canals in Amsterdam, of a thriving brewery traded away, the whole business, for a handful of the right bulbs, of humble men who had been nobody at all one year, and walked the next year in fine coats, rich on flowers. That was the height of it. The wild, shining, golden top of the wave, the winter of 1636, turning over into the new year of 1637, with the prices higher than they had ever climbed in all the history of the world, and everyone, it seemed, still buying, still certain, still sure down in their very bones that the wealthy strangers from every country on earth would always come and always pay, and that the love of tulips and the price of tulips would simply go on rising, gently and forever, into a golden sky that had no top to it at all. And if you could have drifted that winter, high and silent over the whole sleeping country, you might almost have seen the dream itself, unfolding behind every dark and frozen window. Sober weavers and grave merchants and tired, honest tradesmen, all of them gone down deep into sleep, and all of them dreaming the same impossible dream of endless summer fields of tulips rolling away to the far horizon, flaming crimson and violet and gold, each single bloom worth a small fortune, the whole cold land imagining itself awash in flowers that would never wilt and never fall and never, ever lose their worth. It was the loveliest dream a nation ever dreamed together. and it was, every last petal of it, made of nothing but wind. And then, one ordinary day in February, very quietly, with no warning and almost no sound, it stopped. Let the story slow now, with the season, as we come to the turning of it. Breathe, and let yourself grow heavier, and listen, because the ending is the gentlest part of all. There was no great crash, you understand, no thunderclap, nothing half so dramatic as all the wild stories of the rising had been. It is said that it began at an ordinary auction in the town of Haarlem, the very heart of the tulip country, on an ordinary winter's day. A parcel of bulbs was put up for sale, just as bulbs had been put up and sold 10,000 times before through all that golden year. And the auctioneer called for the opening bids, as he always did. And he waited. And, for the very first time, no one raised a hand. No one called out a price. The room was quiet. He lowered the asking figure, puzzled, and called again into the silence. And again, no one answered him. And a third time, lower still, and still that strange new silence held the room. And in that small held breath, in that one quiet space where, for a whole year, there had always been another eager bid, and now, suddenly, was none. In that one silence, the spell, very gently, broke. For it had only ever been a spell. That was the whole secret of it, laid bare in a single instant. The entire towering, glittering value of the thing had rested all along on one shared belief, held up by nothing but itself, the belief that tomorrow, surely, someone would pay even more than they had paid today. And the very moment that one belief so much as wavered, the moment a single room full of men paused and looked at one another and silently wondered whether it might not be wiser to wait, there was nothing underneath it at all. Nothing solid, nothing to catch it. Only the cold, long drop of the plainest truth in the world, that a flower is a flower, and a sleeping bulb is a sleeping bulb, and a promise is worth only as much as the next man's willingness to believe in it. Within days, the news ran out across the whole country like cracks racing across the ice on a frozen canal. The prices were falling. The buyers had simply vanished, melted away like the frost in the sun. And those who held the contracts, those who had cheerfully promised to pay thousands of guilders, come the spring, for bulbs still asleep in the ground, looked down at their little slips of paper with a cold and sinking feeling, and understood, slowly, that the flowers they had sworn a fortune for might soon be worth almost nothing at all. The buying had stopped, everywhere, all at once, the way a high fever breaks in the small hours of the night and leaves the body weak and damp and bewildered. And a great soft confusion settled over the tulip towns of Holland, as everyone tried at once to reckon what their promises were truly worth now, and who owed what to whom, and how on earth the whole vast glittering tangle of it was ever to be unwound. The growers gathered in worried assemblies to argue what was to be done. The town councils were asked to rule and hardly knew how. And slowly, awkwardly, the great shining dream began to be folded up and quietly put away. Now here we should pause, gently, and be honest with one another, the way this channel always tries to be. Because the stories I have told you tonight, the sailor and his onion, the Englishman and his knife, the great list of oxen and wine and silver, and most of all that picture of a whole nation cast down into ruin by a flower. These are wonderful stories, and they have been told and retold for hundreds of years, and you will find them even now in a great many serious books. But the truth, when patient historians went back, long afterward, and read carefully through the actual dusty records of who really bought, and who really sold, and who really lost, the truth turned out to be a good deal quieter, and gentler, and far stranger than all the legend. For most of those famous and dreadful tales, it seems, did not come from the time itself at all. They came later, and a great many of them came from a single source, a Scottish writer, telling the whole story over again some 200 years afterward, in a wonderful and enormously popular book about the follies and the madness of crowds. He told it grandly and vividly, and more than a little wildly, reaching back for his material to a small handful of old pamphlets from the time. And here is the thing about those old pamphlets, the thing that changes the whole picture. They were not careful reports of what had happened. They were, most of them, very nearly sermons, little moralizing tracts, written at the time by serious, sober, disapproving men who wanted to warn their countrymen against the sin of greed, and who reached, quite naturally, for the most shocking and most colourful examples they could conjure, the better to make the lesson sting. There was one famous pamphlet written as a conversation between two characters, with names that tell you everything about its purpose. One called, more or less, True Mouth, the honest man, and the other called something like Greed Goods, the man hungry for gain. These were not journalists writing down the facts. They were preachers telling a parable. The sailor swallowing a fortune, the fool with his knife and the priceless onion. These were very likely the cautionary tales of their day. The tidy little fables a moralist invents to make a crowd gasp, and then nod, and then go home resolved to do better. Too perfect to be quite true. Told to make a point. And when the careful historians went and counted, when one of them in particular spent long years in the old archives, patiently tracing the real men and the real money, the great wave of ruin she had gone looking for simply was not there. The tulip trade, for all its noise and its fever, had really only ever drawn in a fairly small and tight-knit circle of people. Well-to-do merchants and skilled craftsmen, traders who mostly knew one another already, gathered in those warm, candle-lit back rooms. It was never the whole nation gone mad in the streets, never the poorest of the poor staking their daily bread on a flower. It was a particular crowd in a particular world. And when it all ended, there came no great wave of bankruptcies, no multitudes cast out and ruined, no despairing men drowned in the canals, none of the terrible scenes the legend so loves to paint. Most of those impossible contracts were, in the end, simply never paid at all. The courts, sensibly, declined to enforce such mad winter promises. And after a great deal of arguing and grumbling and negotiating, it was largely agreed that the contracts might be let go for a tiny fraction of their face value, or quietly torn up altogether and forgotten. A very great many people, it is true, had a thoroughly bad fright. Remarkably few were truly, lastingly ruined. And the Dutch Republic, the richest country in the whole wide world, woke up the morning after its strange flower dream, still the richest country in the whole wide world, and went calmly on being so prosperous and proud for a long, long time to come. It is, when you turn it over slowly in the dark, a gentler truth, and a far stranger one than the wild old legend ever was. Not a nation destroyed by a flower, but a nation that, for one single strange winter, briefly and harmlessly forgot itself. A sober, sensible, hard-working people who altogether dreamed an enormous shared dream about something very small and very beautiful, and chased it up into an impossible sky, and then, one quiet grey morning, woke and blinked and felt a little foolish and dusted themselves off and went back to their suppers and their ledgers and their ordinary lives, mostly none the worse, and quietly the wiser. The real damage was done to pride, and to something deeper and harder to name, to the comfortable old certainty that the worth of things is solid, and steady, and sure. For that, perhaps, was the true and lasting shock of the tulip, the quiet, unsettling discovery that a thing could be worth a fortune on one candlelit evening, and almost nothing by the next, and that the whole vast difference between the two lay in nothing more solid and nothing more lasting than what people, together, in a warm room, simply chose to believe. And the flower itself, the small, innocent cause of all of it. The flower was never once to blame, and the flower, in the end, did perfectly well. The Dutch did not fall out of love with the tulip. They only fell out of the strange, brief dream of growing rich from it. And once that fever had passed off and left them, they went on growing tulips and breeding them and loving them with a calmer and a truer and a more lasting affection than the fever had ever been. And over the long centuries that followed, the tulip became, of all the unlikely fates in the world for the flower that had once been worth a fine canal house, one of the most common and most cheerful and most beloved flowers on the whole earth. Until today, the very same low flat fields of Holland that once traded a single sleeping bulb for the price of a house now grow them by the hundreds upon hundreds of millions, in long, glorious bands of colour laid across the spring landscape, stretching away flat to the far horizon under the wide grey northern sky. And they are cheap enough now that anyone at all, anywhere in the world, may carry home a great armful of them for a few small coins and set them in a jug on the table and be glad. The thing that was once worth more than gold became, in the fullness of time, a small everyday joy within the easy reach of everyone, which is, perhaps, exactly and only what a flower was ever truly meant to be. So let that be the gentle thought that you drift away upon tonight. Picture those quiet Dutch towns once more, 400 winters ago, settling slowly back down into their ordinary lives after their one extraordinary season. The canals freezing and thawing and freezing again as they always had. The candles lit in the narrow houses against the early dark. The church bells counting out the unhurried hours. And below the cold gardens, deep in the patient black earth, the bulbs sleeping on, every single one of them, exactly as they had slept all along, untroubled, waiting, as they always wait, for the spring. There was no disaster out there in the dark. There never had been. Only a great many ordinary people who had believed for one little while in something far too beautiful to be true, and who then, gently, stopped believing it and went back to their warm, small rooms and their families and their suppers, none the worse in the end, and rather wiser and ready at last to sleep. There is nothing more to look for tonight, and nowhere left at all to hurry to. Let the prices and the promises fade softly away into the dark. They were only ever made of wind, and the wind has long since blown them all away. Let the candlelit tavern grow quiet, and the laughter die down, and the ledger close, and the last warm light in the last leaded window go gently out over the canal. Let the whole strange shining dream settle and dim and fade. Below the frozen gardens, in the deep patient earth, the tulips are sleeping, every one of them, side by side in the cold, dark soil, not worried in the least about what they are worth, waiting without the slightest care for the warm days that always, always come at last. There is nothing in all the world that you need to do now but rest, exactly the way that whole tired country finally rested, and let the long, cold, beautiful night close softly down over everything. Sleep now. The winter will keep. The canals will keep. The buried flowers will keep their slow and certain secret under the ground. And the spring will come, as the spring always comes, whether anyone at all is awake to watch for it or not. Sleep well.